This is the complete collected works of J.D. Salinger. 4 books, published between 1951 and 1963 originally. These books have been in my possession for probably 40 years. They're some of the oldest things in my media collection. They've been with me everywhere that I've gone. I show the wear for it. I treasure these books as, objects as much as I do for their content. So they're well loved. These are among the most reread books that I have. Salinger is probably the most reread author. I reread all 4 of these in the past 3 weeks. This one, The Complete Catcher in the Rye, I read today. Wasn't planning on doing that, but once I got started, I didn't want to stop. So I'm going to talk about these books in Salinger, and then as a tease or preview, I'll show you this, which in addition to those 4 books is a cornerstone of J.D. Salinger's work and of my collection. It's his last story that was ever published. This is a copy from New Yorker magazine, 1965. All right, so it'll come a little bit later. So J.D. Salinger was born in 1919 on New Year's Day, January 1st. I find that interesting. I missed New Year's Day by several days in my own birthday, and I've always thought January 1st, New Year's Day, would be a cool day to be born on. So Salinger joins the list of luminaries born on New Year's Day, which includes, thank you Wikipedia, Paul Revere, Grandmaster Flash, and Winter from the girl group aespa, pictured here, ready for action. Winter was born on January 1st, 2001, 1101, 92 years after Salinger. So Salinger, he had an upbringing in New York City, went to private prep schools, so a lot of that's reflected in Catcher in the Rye. Holden Caulfield was failed out of several prep schools. He was interested in writing very early on. Had some influential mentors who helped him get published as early as 1940. I think that was the date of his first story, when he would have been 21. And then he was drafted. He was on the beach on D-Day, and also was in the Battle of the Bulge. He interrogated Nazi officers and the like after the German surrender on site at, I believe it was Auschwitz. And all of that really took a big toll on Salinger, as you can imagine. I believe he got treated for stress-related symptoms or results of all that, and some of that's in his work too. All right, so while he was in Europe, he met Ernest Hemingway, who at that time was an extraordinarily famous writer and was writing war dispatches. The two got along very well. Salinger was very impressed with how kind and generous Hemingway was to him, and they exchanged letters for some time afterwards. And Salinger said that was the best thing that happened during the war. Those are 2 writers who aren't often thought of as some people who would be compadres, but glad to know they are. Salinger's got to be in my top 3 of favorites, maybe 4 if I include Hemingway. The other 2 would be definitely F. Scott Fitzgerald and Philip Roth, all American writers, all from the 20th century. And so, with that preface, Catcher in the Rye was first published. This is his only novel that was published in 1951 to immediate success. what can I say about this book? When I reread it today for maybe the 10th time, if it's an exaggeration, that's not by much. But I laughed out loud several times. I was particularly struck today by the extraordinarily dark and sarcastic humor that permeates the whole book. He's just so good at cutting remarks, whether spoken verbally as a character, as part of the dialogue, or as part of his interior monologue that the whole book consists of. Holden Caulfield is 16, the narrator of this book, and most of Salinger's major characters are quite young. What else stood out in my reading today? A lot of perversion, as Holden calls it. A lot of perverts surround him when he checks into the hotel in New York City. And all of this always was extraordinary to me, by the way, that a 16-year-old boy in, I guess, the early 50s could go to bars, order drinks. Sometimes he was successful, sometimes not. He smoked cigarettes, took taxis, got a hotel room. A lot of drinking going on by Holden and others. When he checks into the Fleabag Hotel in Manhattan, he sees through the windows opposite a cross-dresser putting on her clothes, and modeling in front of the window. And in another window, he sees an extraordinary scene of a man and woman drinking liquid out of glasses and then spitting that liquid in each other's faces. Clearly some kind of prelude to an even more raunchy event, but this is what Holden sees when he checks into the hotel. Later that night, he has the bellboy bring up a prostitute, who he then declines to have sex with, pays her the agreed upon amount anyways, and then gets beat up by said bellboy / pimp, who extorts him for double the money that Holden had agreed to. The amount agreed to was $5. They ended up getting 10 out of Holden, plus a punch in the stomach. Anyway, that's the world that this novel exists in. It's also a very privileged world, of course, prep schools, and Holden's family lives in Manhattan. There are some scenes in Central Park and Museum of Natural History, several hotels, both high and low. So Catcher in the Rye, that'd probably be the work that Salinger is best known for today by the general reading public. Okay, so then that was 51, Catcher in the Rye. In 1953, published this short story collection called 9 Stories. A collection of stories, most of which had appeared in the New Yorker magazine. That was sort of his home. Between the years of 1948 and 1953. One other story from Harper's here, from the acknowledgement page. So with 9 Stories begins J.D. Salinger's kind of lifelong work, I guess you could say. A series of interconnected stories involving members of the Glass family. Consisted of 7 children, and in this collection here, A Perfect Day for Banana Fish may have been the earliest published story, from 1948, discusses the oldest brother Seymour's suicide on vacation in Florida with his wife when he was at age 31. The character was age 31. Okay, so that's Seymour Glass. Uncle Wiggily in Connecticut is sort of tangential. It's about the former girlfriend of one of the twin brothers of the Glass family. His name was Walt, and he was a GI in the war, got killed in a freak accident opening up a general's Japanese lantern, which he had purchased as a gift or as a luxury. So Walt has died, and Uncle Wiggily in Connecticut talks about his girlfriend at that time, who then gets married and has a child, and moves to Connecticut. I don't want to give away too much of these stories, but I want to give a little sense of how they, in this case, connect with the glasses. This one, the Eskimo story, does not. Neither does Laughing Man. Down at the Dinghy, though, is the story of Boo Boo Glass, a married named Tannenbaum, and her young son having a crisis moment. So that's another Glass family story. For Esme, Love and Squalor, maybe the best known of Salinger's stories of this bunch, seems clearly modeled on his own experiences in the war. The narrator of all the Glass stories, spoken or implied, or in the stories themselves, is Buddy Glass, who's in many ways a J.D. Salinger substitute, I guess you could say, or stand-in. So this story is about a soldier who's in England, about to go to D-Day. A lot of the circumstances of Salinger's own service are in here. Great story. Pretty Mouth and Green My Eyes, a non-Glass story. Always the one that mystified me the most in this collection. If you're so inclined to read any or all of this, I'm not going to spoil this, but what you think is happening in this story is really not happening until you get to the end. Also, one of the most frank depictions of sexuality, not graphic, but the entire story takes place while a man and a woman are laying in bed together. Didomio Smith's Blue Period is a fascinating story about an artist. And then Teddy. It's a non-Glass story, but for all intents and purposes, Teddy, the character, could be a version of Seymour Glass. So Teddy in this story is a precocious child of, I believe, 10, on a cruise. He's just been interviewed by a team of psychologists and doctors and so forth because he's a genius, a prodigy of some type. Most notably, he seems to have the ability to foresee the future, because he told some members of the examining team when and how they would die, or at least that's what they think he said, as well as into the past through meditation and other modes to access past existences. So with Teddy, that's a theme that becomes very strong through a lot of the other, well, I guess I could say the 5 following Glass stories after this. So this is an amazing collection. Read it if you can read any of it. Maybe the least known, I guess, of Salinger's works. I'm not sure. Here, Franny and Zoe, this is probably my favorite. Franny and Zoe. This is 2 short stories, both from the New Yorker. One from 1955, Franny. That's the shorter of the 2, about 50 pages in this book. And then the other one, Zoe, appeared in 1957. It's much longer. A novella, a long short story or a short novel. So the 2 bound together, Franny and Zoe. These are the 2 youngest members of the Glass family. Franny, the youngest girl. She's in college at the time of this story. And then Zoe is a couple years older than her. He's an actor in New York City. And I think a male model of some type as well. All the Glass children have extraordinary intellects in the telling of these stories. They were all on a quiz show called It's a Wise Child. Interesting to me, Dr. Neptune, because I was long ago in my childhood on a quiz show called It's Academic. And, but this was a radio show. This takes place between the 20s, I guess, and the 40s, to cover all 7 Glass children. They were all on the show. And apparently the way their appearances are described, they said some pretty crazy stuff, kind of like Teddy and Teddy's story, talking about mystical and mystifying things. Franny and Zoe, why is it my favorite of all Salinger? I love the structure, the short story of Franny, going to meet her boyfriend Lane for the big football game up in New England. She's having some kind of spiritual crisis. Many of the characters in Salinger are. Salinger himself was very, very, very deeply involved in many spiritual pursuits, including Zen Buddhism, but not limited to that. Seems to have tried many different modes of existence. So I like how concentrated that first story is of Franny. And then Zoe picks up immediately afterwards. Franny passes out at the end of Franny. There's a lot of passing out, losing consciousness in these stories. Zoe takes place immediately after that in their apartment that they grew up in Manhattan. Their two parents, Bessie and Les, were vaudeville entertainers, so their whole family is connected with the entertainment business in some way. All of them can sing and dance, and did so on that radio show and in other contexts. Zoe, as I said, is an actor. Zoe, the story, I love for its intense, descriptive nature. It's very cozy setting. Most of the first 2/3, I'd say, of it take place in the family bathroom. Zoe's taking a bath at the beginning, and then with the curtain drawn, he has a conversation with his mother, Bessie, who comes in and sits on the toilet and has an extended talk with him. And then next scene, same room, he's shaving. She again comes in and continues the conversation. So I feel like that's my home, I swear. It's so descriptive. One thing I really enjoyed on this last rereading of all these books of Salinger is paying very close attention to how he describes spaces, rooms, how the light comes in, who's sitting where, what their postures are, their physical relation to each other. He is just brilliant at all of that. Okay, so the story about the most facile way to describe it would be about spiritual crises and how to sort of handle them, with a heavy dose of advice from Seymour, who, again, the oldest Glass brother. He's sort of the guru, the sage, the one who, with Buddy, 2 years his junior, the writer, sort of educated all the remaining siblings and homeschooling them, in effect. And bringing them up to be aware of these issues of spirituality and so forth. So I've mentioned Seymour, Buddies, then Boo Boo is next. The twins are next. The twin boys, Walt, who I mentioned, died in the army, and then Waker, very interestingly, he doesn't appear in any of these stories really as an adult. It briefly passes through as a child in some flashback scenes, but Waker is described as a priest, a Roman Catholic priest, I believe it's in Franny. In one of these two stories, there's a note that describes he's in Ecuador on some sort of missionary work. And then when we get to the last book that was published, in 1963, a different story tells us that Waker is a Carthusian monk and is currently impounded. And when I first read that, I thought maybe it meant he had been arrested for some sort of social protest. But then I Wikipedia'd Carthusian, and it turns out those are the monks that pretty much avoid all contact, even with other monks. They live, in their cells. They have vows of silence. They get their food passed to them like a prisoner on death row or something, through a slot in the door or something. So Waker is doing that, and that's to me is a strong kind of reflection of Salinger's own interest in such a kind of monastic lifestyle. He lived practically as a monk himself, by most accounts. After he stopped publishing, he lived until 2010 quietly in a village up in New Hampshire, or Vermont, I think, and lived a kind of reclusive life. So you see that life being enacted in his character Waker. Also, Holden Caulfield, which I just read today, The Catcher in the Rye, he has a couple of fantasies about living, a near monastic lifestyle, getting away from it all. and one or two other of his characters express the same ideas. So it occurs to me that the light is dimming here, but that's okay with me. So this is the final book volume of Salinger's stories, both of which are novella length, about the same length as Zoe, about 100 pages each in this edition. Raise High the Roof Beam Carpenters and Seymour, an introduction. First story published in 1955, I believe, same as Franny. Yeah, and then the second one, 1959. The first story, Raise High the Roof Beam, that's a quote from Sappho that appears in here. There's a lot of references to other writers in Salinger and downright reading lists, actually. So, Raise High the Roof Beam Carpenters. Story told by Buddy Glass. He's on leave from the Army in New York City. It's Seymour's wedding day, and Seymour doesn't show up. This is in the 40s. I don't know the date. Doesn't matter. And much discussion of what happens on that day. And then Seymour, an introduction here, and then the last published story that I'll show you, those photocopies. This is where Salinger really breaks with narrative structure completely. Seymour, an introduction, is not a story in the sense of a beginning, middle, end type thing. It's an extended meditation on the meaning of this character, Seymour. Again, written by Buddy Glass, his younger brother. It's extraordinary. This is where really, though, Salinger started to lose some readers and a lot of critics. Got a lot of harsh criticism for some of his later work, who felt he was just being self-indulgent, and well, it's understandable. He's creating his own world, but if you buy into it, like I obviously have for my whole reading life, it's amazing. And Seymour, an introduction, is an essential read in all of this. Which brings us here, and I decided to flick those lights on because here on Neptune we do have a mountain range to the west, and that's that way. There's a big window just beyond the boundaries of the screen, and once the sun starts setting, it gets dark pretty quick. So I did want to show this. Now, that last book, Raise High the Roof Beam, that was published in 1963. The second story, Seymour, was published in 1959. J.D. Salinger didn't publish anything between those times, and the only thing that he published after that is this story. June of 1965. This is the New Yorker magazine. The story's title is Hapworth 16, 1924. Almost the entire story, starting here after this very brief italicized introduction from Buddy Glass. It's in the form of a letter that was written by Seymour in 1924 to the rest of his family. Him and Buddy are at summer camp up in, I think, Maine. Does it say Maine? Yes, Lake Hapworth, Maine. And it's a long letter, completely formless, again, in terms of narrative structure. Many anecdotes and incidents, but also many reflections, digressions. I was struck, actually, by Catcher in the Rye today. One of Holden's scenes is when he's talking about how when other guys make speeches in class, he preferred when they went off topic. He liked the digressions more than the actual content of the story, which strikes me as a justification of much of Salinger's method, especially in his later writing. Also, this very, very polarizing. In fact, Wikipedia claims that this story was universally panned, and I can see why. In 1924, the character Seymour was 7 years old. All right? Just that fact alone makes this absurd. Just look at any of this. There's no way that, that reflects any type of reality. However, if you buy into Salinger's, I guess, points about Seymour, he is a reincarnation. This is how I read it. A reincarnation of many generations worth of scholars, religious types, spiritual types, and wise men and so forth. Seymour, like Teddy from the 9 Stories Teddy, foresaw his own death. Mentions several times in this letter both the absurdity of his writing such things at age 7, including some very frank sexual observations about some of the camp counselors and staff. Not grotesque or in any way, offensive. Salinger was never like that, but Seymour's writing is just unbelievable, literally unbelievable. But if you can get past that, this is probably the most important story in the whole Glass published mythology. The second half is a reading list. He's asking to go to the library and get things like the complete works again of Leo Tolstoy. The rest, other stories have many quotations that Seymour and Buddy had written on their bedroom wall. They had written in letters to others. I mentioned the Sappho quote from Boo Boo on Seymour's wedding day. So just a completely precocious and pretentious, and to some readers insufferable style and content. But I love it, obviously. And this story is not available in any way other than, I think, going to the New Yorker somehow and getting it there. I probably made this copy 30 years ago, maybe 35. I could get a cleaned up copy, I'm sure, but I don't want it. This item that I'm holding in my hands has a lot of meaning to me. I had to work to get this. When I got interested in Salinger, it must have been in the 80s. Okay, all through the 80s. Early on, I started reading, and then when I got to college, I started figuring out how to do research. So I don't remember exactly, but I'm sure I must have read a bibliography or biography of Salinger, which contained information that I didn't know about, such as the fact that he had other stories that weren't in the books that I was so familiar with already. So now remember, this is pre-internet, all right? So I'm sure that it's probably a lot more easy to get a hold of something like this now than it was back then. But that's partially why I guess this has so much meaning to me, is that I had to go out of my way to find it. I remember first I went to the bound volumes of magazines that were in the stacks at the SUNY Buffalo Research Library. Found the correct edition of the New Yorker, but wouldn't you know it, some bastard had cut the whole story out. It's just atrocious. And so this came from the Canisius College library stacks, again in Buffalo, New York, which friends of mine attended. And their copy of this was intact. So I photocopied it, and because it's a volume, it's part of probably a year's worth of New Yorker magazines. It's a very, very thick volume. Since this was the June issue, it's right in the middle. So I had to open up the volume as much as I could to make the copy. So this edge would be the binding between the two pages. And not every single letter on every column comes out, and some come out a little blurry like that. And then when we get further in, we've got two very narrow columns on facing pages, so I just opened it as wide as I could. This is the crease down the middle. Some of the words kind of disappear, the letters disappear in there. I don't care. I don't want a better version. It makes it seem like a special effort or something to approach this practically sacred text to me. I also love the fact that there's no page numbers. I really don't even know how long this story is. but I don't care. It took more than an hour to read, probably. But it's, I don't know, has an almost magical pull to me. I hope I'm expressing at least some of it well here. Also, there's really fascinating ads all the way through, ads from the period. I wanted to point out one in particular towards the back here. Well, first of all, Maker's Mark looks exactly the same now as it did in 1965. But where is he? Ads for cruises, vacation spots. Here we go. You know that guy. The laugh record that puts you way in with Woody. Woody Allen Volume 2 must have been his first comedy album. Before he made films, Woody Allen was a stand-up comic. And very, very successful. Had a lot of really popular albums. All right. So there's Hapworth 16, 1924. A couple other things I have to show along the same line. At the same time, I was trying to locate, well, I guess I was trying to find as much as I could. So in another source, which I've long forgotten now, this is one of his very first stories that was published around 1940, I believe. Go See Eddie. It says about a verbal argument. Actually, it gets a little physical between a brother and sister. Doesn't have much of the hallmarks of the Salinger I love. Good at descriptions again. The characters position themselves in very meaningful ways towards each other that express, their feelings. But as you can see, it's pretty short. There's not much to go with here. This was collected in the only posthumous post-death publication of Salinger, along with two other stories from around the same times. Through some weird quirk of the copyright laws, this story and the other two are in the public domain. So that means pretty much anyone can publish them who wants. Again, they're not great, but they're there. So Go See Eddie is one of my other Salinger copies that I have here. And then these other two both directly bear on Catcher in the Rye. At the beginning of Catcher in the Rye, there's a credit that says, one incident appeared in a different form in Collier's, December 1945, and one incident appeared as a story in the New Yorker, December 1946. It's that story, the 1946 one, that I have here. Slight Rebellion off Madison. And this is very, very, in some cases, word for word, an incident that occurs in the novel when Holden goes to meet a girl that he knew, goes to see a play with the Luntz. It's developed more in Catcher in the Rye, so it's better. The story cuts off. I don't know why I don't have the end of it here. I actually kind of liked it. I like it that way, though. Again, it almost makes it a mysterious document of interest only to real Salinger freaks, though, because pretty much the same thing is in the other book, The Catcher in the Rye. And finally, I have this, also connected to the Caulfield family story, if you can call it that. This is a terrible copy, and the reason for that is this is a copy that was made directly from a machine called a microfiche. This is an ancient piece of technology, similar, I guess, to microfilm, in that it would store on a plastic card, like it's transparent card, but it had photographs of pages of magazines and books on it. Many pages, like, 50, 60 pages in miniature. On a card, a plastic card about this big. You put in a reader, you'd have to move it around, look at it on a big screen. I worked with machines like this all through graduate school. They're terrible. And you can barely read these words, but you can read them. And so just like the Hapworth story that I could get a cleaner copy of. I don't really want one of this. It's an artifact in and of itself. Story was published in, it says October 1945, Esquire. It is mainly about Holden Caulfield's older brother, unnamed, I think, in this story, but he's the main character, and he's with a group of other soldiers in the rain. It's kind of a story about the pointlessness and absurdity of the existence of a soldier, I guess. He has reference to his brother Holden. In fact, this little sub-headline there gives a little bit of away. In the army truck in the Georgia rain, he, the narrator, couldn't forget his brother, that's Holden, was missing. So there's references to Holden throughout there. So that is my complete J.D. Salinger collection. It's the first time I've done a book or an author discussion on this channel. Let me know what you think, and I'll do some more. But thanks for watching, and I'll be back soon.